learners, welcome to our segment today. I am your instructor, CPA Ringo Frederick. In our class today, I want us to handle advanced management accounting, and the concept that I want us to study today is all about the concept to do with learning curve. Remember, learning curve is a very practical concept which, of course, affects us in our day-to-day activities. So what about learning curve? At any given point, when you're hearing about learning curve, my good student, we are looking at a concept whereby you'll find that your work will always, or rather the time that you're taking to perform a task will always tend to reduce based on the experience. The more you perform a task, the lesser time you'll be taking in performing that task compared to when you started. Say, for example, today I'm a very new accountant. Probably I've just gotten an internship in an audit firm. At this point, you'll find that I'm given maybe a file to watch. Might take me like 3 or 4 days to watch this file. But as the time goes by, maybe I spend say like 3 months. Instead of me taking 3 days, you'll find that because of the experience that I've gained, I might be taking say like 2 days. Through my experience, I'm there for like 6 months. The same file that I was watching for like 3 days, I'm going to take a day to watch everything on the file. So you'll find that the more I am in a certain task, the more experience we gain and the lesser time I'm going to take to perform a certain task. This is the process now. That is what you're terming it as learning curve. Maybe if I told you to explain it using maybe this simple graph. Take, for example, this is our graph, so that I want to explain the concept of learning curve. I know I explained it earlier on, but it is important, again, for us to do a review, right? You're having your production here. Let our production be represented, say, by X. And you're having our time here. Let our time being represented by, say, T. So you realize that my learning curve will be in this context, whereby I can have something like that. So this person being very new in a certain task, you'll find that I'm going to take, let me have it to slant a bit so that it can fit very well what Molim wants to explain. So this is what you're having here. This is what you're having here. So you'll find that this person being very new, probably I'll be taking, assuming this one is our T1. You'll find that this is the number of units that I'll be producing. The more I am there, the more I gain experience. You'll find that my time will be reducing, whereas our production increases. The more I am there, the time still will reduce, whereas our production increases. But it reach a point whereby my good students, regardless of how good I am, I will be having a constant time. Regardless of how good you are in this production, you'll be having a constant time. So you'll find that this graph will clearly give us the concept of learning curve. Then, the other key item that you must recall anytime you're handling the learning curve concept is learning curve is always an nonlinear function equation. Is always a nonlinear function, or rather nonlinear function, right? Equation, nonlinear equation or function, where at this point, the whole concept, the whole premise of learning curve, based on our graph here, we can clearly and confidently say that majorly this concept will affect the time that I am taking in performing this task. This time in terms of costing will translate to the labor cost. So looking at this case, you'll find that talking of this equation, we normally tend to talk of two equations. The first equation, it will give us our average time, where if at all I want to determine our average time or cost of performing this task, these are what must always tend to click at the back of our mind. we've said and we've agreed it is a non-linear equation. So I'll be talking of a x raised to power b. I'll be explaining these variables. Whereas in this case you've agreed this is to determine the average time that we will be taking. The other bit, we are having the total time, which in this case, we are talking about y. So y will be talking of ax raised to power b plus 1. So in this case, we are talking about the total time. This is how we can determine our total time. So explaining these variables, remember I'm just doing a recap because we had already handled this. So what Mwalimu is doing, just a recap of what you did. Explaining these variables for us, we can see we're having A here, we're having X, and you're having B. These are very important variables that you must be able to understand anytime we are dealing with learning curve. These are the most important variables that you must always tend to understand anytime we are dealing with learning curve. So allow me to remove this bit so that we can have our space. Then of course you're going to return that question that you're doing. So most important, it will be for us to understand these variables so that whenever you find them, of course, in any problem that you're handling, it will be very easy for us to understand. So when you are talking about A is simply the time or cost of producing the first unit. A simply stands for the time or cost of producing the first unit. Time or cost of producing the first unit. Producing the first unit, or if at all you can term it as batch. X. X will give us, my good students, cumulative production level. So X will simply stands for our cumulative production level. And the keyword that Mwalimu is talking about, what? We are talking about cumulative production level. Cumulative. Whereas B will simply give us what we normally refer to as the learning index. Learning index. And for us to determine our learning index here, which is B, always recall, we'll always be talking of log R divided by log 2. R is simply our learning rate. R is simply our learning rate. So we'll be talking of log R, we divide by log 2. We've said and agreed that the white bar here, as we've clearly stated there, that is simply the cumulative average time of producing a unit of production. This is white bar. And we literally explain it at this point. The cumulative average time of producing what? That product or production. Why? That is the cumulative total time of producing the products. Cumulative total time of producing the products. So these are very good foundation that you can have to understand the whole concept of learning curve. This is just the beginning, because once you have these basics, then you will be able to handle any question that comes along when you're dealing with learning curve concept. So after we've studied this important area, the other thing that I'll also want us to look at, maybe you will be asked, what are the applications of learning curve? And actually that is what you're asking this question of ours. If at all you can check this question that Mwalimu had shared here earlier on, look at part B. We told the learning phenomenon applies to time and will affect any cost which is a function of time. That is what we've said. Whenever costs are estimated, the potential impact of learning should be considered. Should be considered. So we've agreed that the learning curve concept will always affect the costs that do relate with time. So the question here is, we are supposed to, number one, highlight 4 areas where the learning curve is applied in business. Application of learning curve in business. Now we are looking at it in reality. Application of learning curve in business, right? Application of learning curve in business. Now we are looking at it in a very practical situation. So number one thing that you must agree is that we are looking at the aspect of estimation, right? So number one key item where learning curve will always be used in the business, my good students, we will be talking about key aspect like budgeting, right? Or where we normally talk about what? Aspect of forecasting. So it is very important then for us to maybe list some of these advantages which or application which will find that they are very, very practical. So number one, of course, talk about budgeting or forecasting. Budgeting. Why is this important? Budgeting slash forecasting. How will this help us? That's the most important question that we need to ask ourselves, right? So you'll find that at this point, the companies, of course, will always tend to use standard costing for much of their production. And standard costing is always about what? Aspect of budget. So given the fact that at this point, I can be able to establish, right, the learning concept of my employees, I can be able to know the time that can be taken based on our experience. You can be able to identify the time that can be taken to produce a certain product. So by this, it will also lead us to know the component of what? The component of cost I'm going to pay in relation to labor. So based on this, it will be very important for us to state like, because of our past experiences has always been the trend. I can easily come up with a labor cost budget simply based on the learning curve concept. So that is one item that you should also be able to have. Of course, that will take us to number two, the component to do with pricing decisions, right? Remember, at any given point in time, whenever we want to price our products, this will always be the main components. We'll always be talking about the material cost. We'll always be talking about the key item known as labor cost. And we'll always be talking about the overheads. So, combining these three main costs will enable us to understand the cost that you'll spend in a product. And because you've learned that learning curve will always affect the labor cost area, so you'll find that if at all we can be able to establish the cost that I'm going to incur in relation to labor, this will lead us then to come up with the product cost. After we have arrived at the total cost of this product, we can easily establish our price based on the cost that we have incurred. Again, you can see clearly how learning curve can be applied simply by establishing what? The labor cost per unit. So that's another area of learning curve application. The other key area that you can also talk about is aspect to do with work scheduling, right? Work scheduling. Very important to understand work scheduling. So about schedule of our work, my good students, you'll find that to take full advantage of the learning effect, the idle production time should always tend to be avoided fully. In a sense that we are looking at it because we know very well that I'm having employee X, this person is very new, and based on our farm, this has always been the learning rate. So I will be expected to understand the duration that this individual is going to take in our production. And that's why we're talking about what? The work scheduling component. It will help us to schedule our work very effective and well. The other key item that you can also talk about here is talk about maybe recruiting right? Recruitment. Talk about recruitment here. Talk about recruitment, recruiting new labor, recruiting new labor. This will also be an application of learning how, right? Where the question will be how. So you'll find that when a company plans to take on new labor to help probably with increasing production, you'll find that the learning curve assumption will always tend to be reviewed based, of course, on how other employees have been operating, Of course, even on this talk about applications that you are looking at, you'll find that you are basing them on so many limitations, right? And that's why if at all you can check the question, I think we are also asked about the limitations of learning curve. So if at all you can analyze this question, see the other part where we were asked to describe 4 limitations of using learning curve in business. You see part B of the question, part 2 of the question. Describe 4 limitations of using the learning curve in business. So here will come a limitation. Even as much as you're looking at all these applications, there is that limitation that will always be attached to a learning curve. So the big question will be, what are some of these limitations, right? What are some of these limitations that we'll always tend to talk about anytime we are dealing with learning curve? And this is what I want us to analyze some of these limitations. So looking at the limitations of learning curve, looking at the limitations of learning curve, limitations of learning curve, right? Limitation of learning curve. These are what we'll be looking at. Number one, you'll find that it assumes that conditions at work, will enable learning to take place. Some certain environments are always toxic, right? Just to be, if I told you to look at it on a very, very practical perspective. So learning curve will always assume that the conditions of the work where we are, right? They'll always be they'll always be very stable. It assumes that the conditions of work will always be very stable. Stable conditions at workplace. Stable conditions at workplace, which will enable this learning to take place. But in reality, this might not be the case. There are so many factors which will affect us at that point, of course. Another key area you'll find that it also assumes that uh, at this point you'll find that it assumes that a certain degree of motivation amongst employees, whereby for me to continue learning, I'll always be motivated in a way. So it assumes that there's that motivation, right? It assumes a certain degree of motivation, assumes a certain degree of motivation, which of course will motivate these workers to work more and more and more, which in reality, many a times, that might not be the case. In reality, many a times, might not be the case. Then you'll find that, of course, we are living in a very dynamic world where things will always tend to change. So in the event that our production line change, you'll find that maybe talk about in the event that maybe when production techniques change, right? At any given point, when you're having change in production techniques, then many a times the learning curve will always not be applicable in such a case. And so many other assumptions that you can always tend to consider in terms of that's what you're talking about, what limitations. So you'll find that our learning curve is a very interesting key area, which we've clearly seen how the same can also be applied in our day-to-day activities. So after we've learned the foundation of learning curve concept, then I'll want us to proceed to this next question, where we will be required, of course, to handle a question for learning curve. So this was just about the introduction of learning curve. I want you guys to meet me in the next session. Actually, the link of the second class, I'm going to download it on the comment section below this video. So just check the link of this class, the next class, where we are going to handle this question. See this question? This is what I want us to handle. So we've handled part B1 and part B2. So in our next segment, I want us to handle the part C of this question. I want us to handle part C of the question, where we are told Spacecom Limited is about to bid on a new radar system. Although the product uses new technology, Spacecom Limited believes that a learning rate of 75% is appropriate. So the first unit is expected, of course, to consume 700 hours, and the contract is for 40 units. I am required to, number one, determine the total amount of hours required to build the 40 units. Number two, the average time to build each of the 40 units, and assuming that a worker works 2,080 hours per year. So you're supposed to determine the number of workers that should be assigned in the contract, to be assigned to the contract to complete it in a year. So these are good questions, which I'll want us, of course, to do it in our next class, having looked at the foundation of learning calc. See you guys in our next class. Bye.